Imagine a room filled with the scent of old mahogany and the stifling weight of unspoken grievances. On a polished table sits a single document, a stack of vellum that represents 40 years of clinical precision, global expansion, and an accumulated net worth of $400 million. For the heirs of the Sterling estate, this moment was supposed to be a formality. In the upper echelons of Manhattan's elite, wealth is often viewed as a birthright, an inevitable river that flows from one generation to the next, protected by the ironclad walls of bloodline and tradition. They gathered in that room not out of grief, but out of expectation. They were the architects of their own future luxuries, already spending the interest on a principle they hadn't yet touched. But as the lead executor cleared his throat, the air in the room didn't just turn cold, it turned clinical. The opening of a high net worth estate is usually a choreographed dance of probate law and tax mitigation, a dull affair of numbers and percentages. Yet within the first 10 minutes, the rhythm broke. The primary irrevocable trust, the very vessel intended to carry the Sterling legacy into the next century, contained a provision that no one, not the children, not the ex-wives, not even the long-term personal assistants, had ever seen. It was a clause buried under layers of dense, archaic legalese, hidden behind a firewall of offshore shell companies and secondary fiduciaries. It wasn't just a condition, it was a bypass. In the world of Tier 1 finance, we often speak of the ironclad nature of a bloodline, the idea that wealth is biologically tethered. We assume that the law exists to facilitate the transfer of power within a family. But what happens when the patriarch, a man who built an empire on the ruthless application of logic, decides that blood is a liability? The Sterling heirs were about to discover that their names, written in the family Bible and etched into the glass of the holding company's lobby, meant absolutely nothing. The $400 million was moving, shifting like a subterranean plate, away from the lineage and toward a destination that defied every convention of estate planning. This wasn't a clerical error or a simple case of disinheritance. This was a sophisticated, multi-jurisdictional maneuver designed to ghost an entire family. The impossible problem wasn't just the loss of the money, it was the realization that the man they thought they knew had spent the last decade of his life architecting their obsolescence. As the executor reached the third page of the summary, he uttered a phrase that would trigger a 3-year legal war, a phrase that questioned the very definition of a beneficiary. The question wasn't who was getting the money, but rather, what had the family done to trigger a secret kill switch that had been lying dormant for 20 years? The wolves were at the door, but the door had already been removed from its hinges. This is the story of how a $400 million fortune vanished in plain sight, bypassed the DNA of its creator, and left a bloodline staring at an empty vault, all because of a single hidden sentence that redefined the concept of loyalty. To understand the magnitude of the betrayal, one must first understand the man who built the fortress. Alistair Sterling was not a man of sentiment, he was a man of systems. Rising from the gritty, cutthroat corridors of 1970s merchant banking, he viewed the world as a series of leveraged buyouts and risk-adjusted returns. He didn't just accumulate wealth, he engineered it, moving from distressed debt in London to massive infrastructure plays in Southeast Asia. By the time the mid-90s arrived, the Sterling name was synonymous with a specific kind of untouchable old-world gravity. He was the quintessential patriarch, a figure of silent authority who treated his family like a subsidiary of his primary holding company. His children, Julian and Beatrice, were raised in the shadow of this immense capital, groomed not to create, but to curate. They were the beneficiaries of a discretionary trust that funded a life of private jets, Swiss boarding schools, and the quiet arrogance that comes with never having to check a balance. Julian was the heir apparent, a man who possessed his father's penchant for expensive suits, but lacked the predatory instinct required to maintain the empire. Beatrice, on the other hand, was the socialite philosopher, spending a fortune on philanthropic ventures that were often more about optics than impact. To them, the $400 million was a static fact of nature, as certain as gravity. They viewed their father's complex web of offshore accounts and private foundations as a protective moat designed to keep the taxman at bay and ensure the Sterling bloodline remained a permanent fixture of the global elite. They never suspected that the moat was actually designed to keep them out. Alistair's primary vehicle was an irrevocable trust, a legal entity that, once established, is notoriously difficult to alter. In the eyes of the law, the assets held within such a trust no longer belong to the individual. They belong to the trust itself, managed by fiduciaries for the benefit of the named parties. For decades, the children were the named parties. They watched as the principal grew, shielded from the volatility of the markets and the prying eyes of the IRS. But Alistair was a master of the fine print. He understood that while an irrevocable trust is permanent, the definition of a beneficiary can be fluid if the governing documents are drafted with enough malice and foresight. He lived his final years in a secluded estate in Connecticut, surrounded by a rotating staff of nurses and high-priced lawyers, maintaining a distance that the family mistook for the frailty of age. In reality, it was the silence of a man finishing a masterpiece. He was working with a boutique firm in Zurich, crafting a series of amendments and decanting the original trust into a new, more opaque structure. This process, known as Trust Decanting, allows a trustee to move assets from one trust to another with different terms, effectively rewriting the rules of the game without the beneficiary's knowledge. While Julian was negotiating the purchase of a Mediterranean villa and Beatrice was planning her next gala, their father was methodically stripping away their status. He was a man who valued utility over lineage, and he had come to the conclusion that his children were a poor investment. The origin of the wealth was blood and sweat, but the destination was being decided by a cold, calculating assessment of merit. Alistair Sterling didn't believe in the divine right of kings, and he certainly didn't believe in the divine right of heirs. He saw the impending transfer of wealth not as a gift, but as a waste of capital. And so he began to weave the secret clause, a legal ghost that would haunt the probate courts for years to come. The true nature of Alistair Sterling's deception emerged during the second week of the estate audit, a process the family assumed would be a mere verification of ledgers. Instead, it became a forensic autopsy of a dead man's intent. The discovery was made by a junior associate at a rival firm hired by Beatrice to ensure Julian wasn't skimming from the top. While digging through the subfolders of a British Virgin Islands holding company, they found a document titled Exhibit D9. It was a cross-border fiduciary mandate that contained the secret clause, a provision legally referred to as a conditional power of appointment combined with a definitive exclusion of issue. In plain English, Alistair had utilized a strategy known as the silent trust, but with a lethal twist. Usually, a silent trust merely keeps the beneficiaries unaware of the assets until they reach a certain age. Alistair's clause, however, was a trigger mechanism tied to a performance-based fiduciary duty. It stipulated that the $400 million would only vest in the bloodline if the family's private equity firm maintained a specific, nearly impossible alpha over a 10-year period. If that metric was missed, which it had been by a fraction of a percent during the 2008 financial crisis, the entire corpus of the trust was to be diverted. The heirs weren't just being cut out, they had been disqualified years ago without their knowledge. The legal brilliance of the maneuver was staggering. By framing the inheritance as a performance-based incentive rather than a gift, Alistair had essentially turned his children into employees of a corporation they didn't know they worked for, and then fired them for underperformance. The money wasn't going to a secret mistress or a distant relative. The clause directed the $400 million into a purpose-built foundation based in Liechtenstein, a jurisdiction known for its impenetrable Iron Curtain laws regarding trust disclosure. This foundation was not dedicated to traditional charity, but to a hyper-specific scholarship fund for the children of the very competitors Alistair had crushed during his career. It was a final, cold-blooded insult. The family lawyers scrambled, citing undue influence and lack of capacity, but the documentation was airtight. Alistair had undergone psychiatric evaluations every 6 months for the last 5 years of his life, specifically to prove he was of sound mind while crafting these amendments. He had anticipated every possible avenue of contestation. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Manhattan social circuit as the realization set in that the Sterling fortune was no longer a family asset, it was a ghost. The irrevocable nature of the trust meant that the assets had technically left Alistair's estate years prior, making them untouchable by the standard claims of the surviving spouse or children. The heirs were now staring at a sophisticated legal bypass that had redirected a nearly $500 million fortune into a black hole of private interests, leaving them with nothing but the deeds to properties that carried massive, unpayable tax liens. The secret clause wasn't just a line of text, it was a tactical nuclear strike on the concept of the family dynasty. The fallout was instantaneous and corrosive, turning the Sterling townhouse from a sanctuary into a war room. Julian, facing the immediate evaporation of his lifestyle, turned his fury not toward his father's memory, but toward his sister. He accused Beatrice of conspiring with the estate's Swiss fiduciaries, suggesting that her frequent trips to Zurich over the years were not for gallery openings, but to secure a private side deal at his expense. The bond of blood, already thinned by years of competitive grooming, snapped under the pressure of the $400 million vacuum. In high-stakes probate, the first casualty is always the truth, followed closely by familial loyalty. Beatrice retaliated by filing a series of injunctions to freeze the remaining liquid assets, effectively starving Julian of the capital needed to pay his personal legal defense. It was a spectacle of mutual assured destruction. As the litigation moved into the discovery phase, the true depth of the betrayal surfaced in the form of archived emails and private memos. Alistair had not just bypassed his children, he had been monitoring them. He had hired a private security firm to document their excesses, their failed business ventures, and their most private indiscretions. Every tabloid headline and every wasted million had been cataloged as evidence of their unfitness to inherit. The secret clause was reinforced by a dossier that portrayed Julian and Beatrice as the ultimate liabilities to the Sterling legacy. The psychological weight of this realization was heavier than the financial loss. They were forced to confront a father who had spent his final decade viewing them as data points in a failed experiment. The betrayal extended to the family's longtime advisors. The family's general counsel, a man who had sat at their Thanksgiving table for 20 years, admitted under oath that he had helped Alistair draft the bypass. He cited his fiduciary duty to the patriarch, a cold professional shield that left the children feeling like strangers in their own home. The public nature of the battle stripped away the last of their dignity. The press dissected the Sterling family's downfall with a voyeuristic glee, painting them as the poster children for the entitled elite who had finally run out of luck. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the acrid reality of a lost empire. The emotional betrayals were layered like the trusts themselves, secrets within secrets, lies within lies. Julian's marriage collapsed under the financial strain, and Beatrice retreated into a pharmaceutical haze, unable to reconcile the image of her doting father with the man who had systematically dismantled her future. They were no longer heirs, they were litigants in a desperate failing battle against a dead man's iron will. The clause had done more than redirect the money. It had successfully deleted the Sterling family as a cohesive unit, leaving behind only a fractured group of individuals, bonded by nothing but a shared sense of victimization and a growing pile of legal bills. The final showdown took place in a sterile courtroom in Lower Manhattan, where the complexity of international trust law met the cold reality of judicial precedent. The Sterling heirs had pinned their last hopes on the doctrine of public policy, arguing that a parent cannot use a trust to exert dead-hand control that is so punitive it effectively destroys the lives of the survivors. Their legal team presented a passionate case, painting Alistair Sterling as a man whose cognitive decline had manifested as a pathological desire to punish his offspring. They brought in experts to testify on the nuances of testamentary capacity, hoping to find a single crack in the armor of the 2008 amendments. But the defense, representing the Liechtenstein Foundation and the executor, was a phalanx of the world's most expensive litigators. They didn't rely on emotion, they relied on the sanctity of the contract. They argued that Alistair had every right to set the terms of his own success, and that the children had failed to meet the clear, objective benchmarks established in the trust's bylaws. The judge, a veteran of high-stakes estate battles, spent 3 weeks deliberating over the thousands of pages of evidence. When the verdict finally came down, it was a masterclass in legal finality. The court ruled that the secret clause was not only valid, but was a sophisticated exercise of Alistair's right to alienate his property as he saw fit. The ruling stated that Alistair had provided for his children during his lifetime, and therefore they had no inherent right to the residual fortune. The bypass was upheld. The $400 million was officially transferred to the offshore foundation, disappearing behind the legal veil of Liechtenstein's secrecy laws. The court even went a step further, ordering that the estate's legal fees, totaling nearly $12 million, be paid out of the few remaining assets the children had hoped to keep. Julian and Beatrice left the courtroom not as millionaires, but as debtors. The empire Alistair Sterling had built was now legally severed from the people who shared his name. The victory for the foundation was absolute, and the defeat for the bloodline was total. As the final signatures were dry on the court order, the assets were liquidated and wired across the Atlantic, leaving the Sterling legacy to exist only in the names of scholarship recipients who would never meet the man who funded their education. The family was left with the ruins of their reputation and the bitter realization that in the eyes of the law, a well-drafted clause is more powerful than the strongest biological bond. The Sterling case became a landmark precedent cited in every law school from Harvard to Oxford as the ultimate example of how a patriarch can use the machinery of Tier 1 finance to execute a final, permanent judgment on his own family. The dust has long since settled on the Sterling estate, but the ripples of the case continue to vibrate through the halls of private banks and family offices worldwide. The $400 million is now a permanent endowment, a self-sustaining engine of capital that operates with a cold mathematical efficiency Alistair Sterling would have admired. It serves as a stark reminder that in the realm of ultra-high net worth wealth, the greatest threat to a legacy is rarely the market or the tax collector. It is the friction between expectations and reality. The karma of the Sterling family was not found in a sudden catastrophe, but in the slow, agonizing realization of their own irrelevance. They had been raised to believe they were the protagonists of a grand story, only to discover they were merely footnotes in a financial strategy. This is the ultimate lesson of the $400 million secret clause. Wealth is not a birthright, it is a tool. And in the hands of a master architect, that tool can be used to build a dynasty or to dismantle one with surgical precision. For the global elite, the Sterling case changed the playbook. It ushered in an era of the incentivized trust, where heirs are no longer given a blank check, but a series of hurdles. It highlighted the power of the decanting process, where the rules of an inheritance can be rewritten in the shadows of offshore jurisdictions, far from the prying eyes of the beneficiaries. But beyond the legal mechanics, there is a deeper, more human takeaway. The Sterling children spent their lives preparing for a future that was never guaranteed, anchored to a fortune they didn't create. By the time they realized the bridge had been burned, they had forgotten how to swim. True financial security, the kind that Alistair Sterling possessed but never passed on, isn't found in a trust fund or a secret clause. It is found in the ability to create value independent of a name or a bloodline. As the Sterling fortune continues to grow in a Liechtenstein vault, the family name has become a cautionary tale in the world of Tier 1 finance, a warning that the same legal structures designed to protect you can just as easily be used to erase you. The ultimate irony remains that Alistair Sterling's final act was his most successful investment. He successfully hedged against the mediocrity of his own heirs, ensuring that his capital would outlive his disappointment. In the end, the money didn't stay in the family, but the lesson remained. In the high-stakes game of legacy, the person who holds the pen always has the last word.